Welcome to Polyphony Digital, or PD Logic, where PD does some things that just PD makes sense. They just plain don't make sense, folks. And today is the first Polyphony Digital, or PD Logic, on my second channel meant for more ranty and controversial things, given that it is called Rantating. And that makes sense, folks. All things considered, I know stuff like pediologics and rants and such are controversial, and some people really like the stuff. I mean, they get quite a lot of views compared to my average video, but some people don't. So I figured I may as well keep on doing it for the people who like seeing it, but move it to its own dedicated channel to appease the people who want to see it, because then they can go directly to this channel to see it if that's what they enjoy from my main channel. And for those who enjoy everything else from my main channel, that will be staying on my main channel. But the rant type videos will be completely on this channel, Rantating. So if you want to see this type of video, subscribe to this channel. I'd still say, obviously, stay subscribed to my main channel either way. But, yeah. Anyway, let's get into it, folks, because I'll make this video nicer than my general video on Rantating, because this one will be going on other platforms like CG Planet and Car Throttle and such, but I'll admit, more videos than not on this channel are going to be uncensored. This one ain't, but this is because it's its own thing. It's a PD logic which existed before. Everything else on this channel is mainly a thing starting from this channel. So anyway, I won't do this intro every time as long, because this is the first PD logic on this channel. Now, let's get into the actual video. To begin with, I'll preface something by saying Polyphony Digital has had a terrible penalty system for Gran Turismo Sport since even before the game came out. It certainly wasn't good in the closed beta, which I got to play, and it's still quite terrible now. As I've said in previous videos, there's been ups and downs throughout the penalty system in the past. Honestly, in my opinion, one of the better iterations of the penalty system was when it was first introduced in the closed beta. How that makes sense, I don't know, but I've showed videographic proof of it, and this is what this is here, folks. This is not the worst I've ever seen the penalty system, but now that there's a new implementation of the penalty system in GT Sport, meaning the time trials, I may as well discuss it again and make its own PD logic, because the penalty system obviously hasn't worked before. There's been many flaws with it in the past, but now, because there's a completely new way of using and or abusing the penalty system, I may as well mention it again, because PD still hasn't done much to fix it, but then yet there's a whole new mode that uses it. But to begin with, this first replay is from the original mode that used it, Sport mode, and PD still doesn't have it right here. The mode has existed in from the very start. As I do on this channel, I will roll the full clip, and then I will go back and analyze it piece by piece. So, let's start it up, folks. This is Daily Race B, and particularly it is Group 3's at Kyoto. So, let's get into it, folks. So, there's the clip, and now I will analyze it. To begin with, as y'all can see through these first two turns, I use all of the rumble strip plus a bit of the grass. And there is no penalty, which I'm perfectly fine with, because in this general terms, what is considered fine to use while racing is anything that still has two tires on the track. Generally speaking, the rumble strips are part of the track because they were built on to it. Like the grass was there naturally, but the rumble strips were physically put there. Meaning the grass is not part of the track itself because it was built around the grass. The grass was there before the track. But the rumble strip was put in as the track was. Granted, this isn't a real world track, but still, the general explanation still counts. Because really, you could count it 4 different ways of what counts as a track, but the way that I'm saying here is probably the best overall way to do it because it's the most consistent. At a track like this, there's what is undisputed track, just the tarmac itself that doesn't have paint on it. That's exactly, obviously, the track. Like this part, no one would dispute that. So if you're on that part, there should definitely never be a penalty ever. There's no doubt about it. But then there's the white line here. Some people say 2 tires beyond the white line is good. Once you have 3 or more tires beyond it, that's a penalty. But the problem with that is there's yet another white line here. So that's kind of iffy to say which white line you use. Plus, all this bit is painted, meaning it's theoretically meant to be different than this. So that's kind of a gray area, which brings me to my next point, the rumble strip. There's only one rumble strip here, and it is quite big, so there's somewhat of a margin for error. That's why I say to use the rumble strip here, because there's 2 white lines, so that's kind of a gray area. And then beyond the rumble strip is only grass. There's no more white lines or anything. So in my opinion, as long as you have 2 tires on the rumble strip, it's a count as on the track. And apparently here, this is what PD is counting as on the track. So, while some people can dispute this, I like this because it is overall the most consistent way of doing it, because using the white line rule is kind of gray area. So, because of this, use the rumble strips, and it works. I mean, I used it, I don't get a penalty, so that's how it should be in my opinion. But, on to the more negative part. But remember the positive part that I said to begin with, because there will ultimately be a negative part later. As I mentioned that now because that was what was on screen now. But what's about to be on screen is this car begins to spin out. I can tell it's spinning out really even before it completely does. As y'all can see, I start moving away from the apex. Normally you want to stay on the apex here until the turn itself ends, but I go ahead and start moving away from it because I noticed this car is losing grip. At this point, I didn't really know if it was going to spin or not, but I knew because it already had grip loss that I would have more momentum than it, and I could just go around more on the outside. But lo and behold, it does end up spinning at about this point. I knew it would, so then I give even more room. I go ahead and go out even more. Like, if it was just loose, I'd probably be another groove in. I wouldn't be right on the apex, but I would still probably be more on the inside. But I knew it was spinning out, so I gave it room to do so. Now, theoretically, I shouldn't necessarily need to give room to do so, because in sport mode, there's supposed to be a ghosting system. If a car wrecks, like if it hits a wall hard, or it spins out, or it gets hit hard by another car, theoretically, then it becomes ghost, transparent, however you want to word it, aka you can drive right through it with no problems. That's how it should be here, because, I mean, I could tell it was spinning out. Theoretically, the computers should be able to tell, too. If the drivers can tell, then the computer should be able to tell. I mean, that just makes logical sense, because ultimately the computer should have a better reaction time than the driver. I mean, that seems fair, doesn't it? Computers are already considered in a lot of ways smarter than humans, so theoretically, it should recognize it's spinning if I do, but no, it doesn't. So, the car ends up hitting me, which I don't think that's the other driver's fault necessarily, and I know it ain't my fault because I gave it a whole heck of a heap of room. Granted, I could have gone up the track even more, but the main reason I didn't is because I knew if the car was going to hit me, if I'm up the track this much already, I will not spin out. Because I knew if I was closer to the track here, there would be a chance that I could spin out, because the other car would be more at an angle at that point. Because the longer the car is on the track, the less angle it is at, because there's more time for the driver to catch it. So, I really saw no reason to go all the way to the outside, because one, the car should be ghosted in the first place, and two, I would have figured by that point the driver would completely catch the car anyway, so even if I do get nudged a bit, it wouldn't really affect me. And, I mean, ultimately, I was pretty much correct. I got hit, I got somewhat loose, but all things considered, I lost about 7-8 miles an hour. No big deal. I mean, probably, yeah, that the driver could have done somewhat better to steer it more towards the wall than towards another driver. But I would say at that instance, the driver was probably also thinking the car should be ghost at this point. So I'm not going to blame anyone here. I mean, it definitely ain't my fault because I gave the other driver room, and even though the driver was the one that initiated the wreck, I had nothing to do with that. I wouldn't blame the other driver either because, I mean, people make mistakes. No one's perfect. So, no big deal, really. I only lost 7-8 miles an hour there, and ultimately I still gain a position, so no big deal. The big deal here is that, again, I saw the wreck coming well in advance, and I figured by the time the car hit me, if it did, which there was a low chance it did because I gave it room, that if it hit me, it would be ghost. But nope, none of those things happened, and because PD messed up doubly, meaning they didn't make the car go ghost, and they gave me a penalty. That's a double PD logic right yonder. Not to mention the thing I mentioned to begin with. Remember the amount of track that I used part, because that will come up in a minute. The double PD logic is the car didn't go ghost when it was obviously spinning, so obviously so I saw it well in advance. And they gave me a penalty. To an extent, it's also a triple PD logic, because look at the wording of what they call the penalty. It'll come up clear in a minute. There we go. Colliding with another car. As y'all could see, probably best to just play this in a fast motion, because it's clearer that way. I'm not colliding with anything here. I mean, that's pretty cotton picking obvious. I give that car a lot of room. I'm not sweaving at all. I'm as straight as I can be in this turn. Like, meaning, yes, I'm turning, but I'm staying in the same lane. So essentially, I'm not colliding with anything. The correct wording to this would be car colliding into you, or something along the lines of that. It's definitely not colliding with another car. Because colliding, the way that it's worded, means that you are physically doing it. Like, collision with another car would be more accurate, because then that could mean it's the other car that causes the collision. But colliding is incorrect because physically I'm not the one that initiates the contact. It's the other driver. Again, I'm not blaming the other driver for it because the car should have been ghost. But still, the wording is wrong about the penalty, and the penalty shouldn't have happened in the first place. Because I could have made this a lot worse. I could have stayed on the inside of the track. If I would have stayed on the inside of the track here, I might have actually gotten away with it a little bit better speed-wise. Because essentially at this point, if I stayed on the inside of the track, most likely I would hit the car at about this point. And yes, at that point I would be hitting that car. Because I'm knowingly aware that it's spinning at this point, but yet if I were to stay on the inside, I would make contact with that car. I would consider that colliding with another car because I'm knowingly doing it. So I could have made this a lot worse, and I could have hit that other car as well. And if I would have hit the other car while it was this loose, because I would have hit it roughly about here, it would have spun completely out. Instead, it had time to save it because I was nice and I gave it room to save it. Granted, again, there was that car colliding into me. I didn't collide. There was no me colliding in anything there. That other car collided into me. But I gave it time to save it. And for the most part, it did. I only lost it again, like 7 or 8 miles an hour there. No big deal. That car, from what I could tell, pretty much saved it completely. I don't actually see it in my rearview mirror, but I don't think it fully spun out. I think it just let off the throttle pretty big time. If I would have stayed on inside there and essentially spun it probably would have lost another 3 or 4 seconds than what it did. And that, to me, would be more deserving of a penalty. Still, I wouldn't say 100% completely deserving of a penalty, but it would have made more sense. The reason that I don't see it being completely deserving of a penalty is because still I wasn't changing my racing line any. I wasn't purposely hitting the other car. I just wasn't trying to avoid it either. So that's sort of a gray area. But what I did is not a gray area whatsoever. I completely avoided the other car. I gave it half the track of room. And it should have been ghost in the first place. So this penalty shouldn't have happened. And the wording of the penalty is also quite stupid. It was only 1 second penalty. I've seen contact to where it goes up as much as 4 seconds as penalty. I don't 100% know what contacts warrant what penalty. But still, a penalty is a penalty. It still forces you to slow down. Which I don't like that either, but I've discussed that in other videos, and I do understand the point of why it's there. And it still affects my race, even though I did nothing wrong. So, moving on to the next thing. Again, remember the first thing about how much track I used before this situation happened. The next thing, and actually this clip I've already uploaded, but now I shall analyze it. This, to give a bit of context, is the time trial event at Willow Springs Streets of Willow in the 98 Honda Civic. This was fairly early on of me trying it. It was before the leaderboards got set even. That's good on PD, that they did fix the leaderboards. But it's bad on PD that one, what I showed in the initial clip, you can still cut the track going into the lap and use all of the runoff beyond the cones. Granted, that is somewhat iffy on if it's truly cutting the track, because it's still paved apart, though they did put cones there. So theoretically, I would count that as cutting the track, because cones seem like an obvious indicator, whether it's a paved section or not beyond the cones, that you shouldn't be going there. But then yet PD lets you go there to begin the lap. But that's not really what I'm focusing on here, because essentially everyone can do it in equal amounts. I mean, if they're not penalizing in the first place, there's really no gray area to it. Everyone can do it, so if everyone does it, it's still sort of kind of fair. But this straight up ain't fair, because there's a gray area in which I don't know it. The other one, there's no gray area. There's not an amount that you pass the cones and then it is a penalty. No matter what, there's no penalty. But here, there's a gray area that still to this day, I honestly don't know where it is. Again, I'll roll the clip in full, though y'all may have already seen the clip, and then I will analyze it. So there's a clip at full speed. To begin with, I start out this early on to show that cones are already there. Like, there's cones blocking off a lot of sections that have pavement beyond them to show that you're not supposed to be there. That's just how this track is, and PD needs to realize that. It's realistic that the cones are there in the first place. I mean, PD did a good job noticing that and putting the cones there. But if the cones are there, the cones should count to block you from going there. They shouldn't just be there as an aesthetic. They should actually do something, because they're meant to do something. And it's been proven again, as I showed before on the first clip, the one that I uploaded a few days ago, they don't do anything. But then yet here, I stay on the track completely. I am somewhat on the white line here, but I do not go beyond it because look in the rear view mirror. I don't kick up any dirt. So therefore I'm not on the dirt. I am on the white line, but I have no more than, I think, even one tire on the white line at any given time, given the angle of the turn. I don't think the car is long enough to have 2 tires on it at any given point. So I'm pretty sure it's no more than 1 tire even on the white line at any given point, and I never go beyond the white line. But yet, in the first clip that I showed in this PD Logic video, I don't just go 2 tires beyond the first white line, or the second white line, or the rumble strips. I have 2 tires completely in the grass. In this, I have 1 tire on the white line, not over it, on it. But then yet, I don't hit any cones, which I will get back to that in a minute. And by the time that sector ends, I don't even think I ever get on this white line. At this point, I'm already turning into the next turn, so therefore I don't think I ever even get on it. And it's obvious it's not because of this turn I get the penalty, because I wasn't even fully on that white line. I was probably 4 inches or so away from it. Not necessarily on purpose, just that's how it ended up being. I didn't have too much practice with this one at that point, so that's just me not quite hitting it where I should. In theory, but in reality, hitting it where I should be on the white line, not even over it, is still a penalty. Again, the penalty definitely shouldn't happen for many reasons. The first of which, it's because, as I showed at the first part of this PD Logic video, if on one track you can use the rumble strip all the way, and then 2 tires on the track, it seems quite unfair that on another track, only 1 tire on the white line is a penalty. Especially when you don't hit the cones. The main point I was making in the clip wasn't even about the white line thing, but I went ahead and brought it up here because I could use it in reference to another clip that I hadn't shown at that time yet, because it didn't happen yet. That one just happened today. But anyway, the point I'm making here is, before, I could cut the track completely by physically hitting the cones and using all that runoff section to go onto the front straight. I could hit the cones going in and out of the runoff section perfectly fine with no penalty. But then yet here, I don't hit any cones as seen in the rearview mirror, as I physically pointed to in the replay that I showed. I put an actual arrow there. No cones got knocked down. I'll zoom in more, just so you can see it for sure. No cones got knocked down. There's 3 there, there's 3 up still. But then yet, I get a penalty. PD doesn't give a penalty for knocking down cones and using a runoff area that's not at all intended to be the track. But then yet, does give a penalty for having 1 tire on the white line, not hitting any cones. So essentially what this is telling me is PD wants you to hit cones and penalizes you for not hitting cones. PD wants you to use the grass, but doesn't want you to use the white lines. I'm pretty sure the point that Willow Springs has the cones here is dual purpose. One, to show new drivers what part of the track they're actually supposed to be on. And 2, so experienced drivers who are accurate enough to actually get near them the point in which you're not supposed to go beyond for the lap to be valid. Which makes logical sense because the 2-tire rule. Look where the cones are angled here. While there is no rumble strip in this particular section, essentially the 2-tire rule still applies. Because to get right close to those cones as possible, you can have 2 tires still on the track. There would be 2 tires beyond the white line and a bit in the sand there, but then yet you could still angle your car to not hit any of the cones. It obviously depends on the speed and such. Like here, I'm not on the dirt, but then yet still get as close to the cones as pretty much possible. I mean, there's a bit of a gap there, but that's probably no more than like 2 inches or something. So, essentially, that's as close as I'm going to get. I mean, I'm certainly not the best driver in the world. So, yes, while people can get closer, apparently it ain't allowed to get closer. And this goes into the point I was making before about the gray area. There's no gray area about using the runoff on the front straight. You can use as much or as little of the runoff area as you want, and it still isn't a penalty. Here, I legitimately do not know how much track I'm allowed to use. Because, as I said, the dual purpose for the cones here are to show what part of the track you're supposed to be on and how much of the track you can use. So I figured at this point that there wasn't gray area here. It was if you didn't hit the cones, you're good. If you do hit the cones, it's penalty. So I didn't hit the cones, so I thought it was good, but then yet it's still a penalty. So I legitimately do not know how much track I can use here, because there's no other indication. An indication on some tracks is the white line itself. If you go beyond the white line, it's penalty. But again, I did not go beyond the white line because I didn't kick up any sand. Beyond the white line is sand. So I legitimately do not know how much track I'm allowed to use here and not get a penalty. But then yet, at the first clip that I showed in this video, as long as I at least have 2 tires on the rumble strips at all times, I can use as much grass as I want. And that's well beyond, like literal feet beyond the white line. And in the clip that I showed in the replay a few days ago, I don't just go beyond the white line, I go well beyond the cones and hit the cones. And it's still perfectly fine to use any and all of that space. So essentially the point of this PD logic all in all is for PD to make a consistent way of knowing how to use track limits. Granted, not all tracks have cones, rumble strips, or necessarily white lines. Maybe all the tracks have to an extent their own version of like a white line or something. But this seems like the easiest way for me to categorize it. As long as you have 2 tires on the part of the track that isn't naturally there, you're good. Meaning, at Willow Springs, you can use the sand to an extent, but as long as you keep 2 tires on the pavement, whether it is a part of the white line or not, it's good. At Kyoto, as long as you keep 2 tires on the rumble strips, but you can have 2 tires on the grass, it's fine. So that way, there's no need to go about cones or anything like that. Now granted, you may be asking how does it work for a section like this, because all of it isn't naturally there. Essentially, for a section like this though, it doesn't matter. Because let's say you do abuse my wording, because all of this isn't naturally there. Well, let's say you are allowed to go beyond this. That really isn't going to help you though, because you would be going through all of the sand there. If you're able to angle your car to be able to go beyond the cones here, the cones aren't naturally there anyway, that would be okay, theoretically with my wording, you would still ultimately have to have 4 tires on what is naturally there to get back on to the track itself. So ultimately you would still be penalized later. So that wouldn't work. And to go back a bit, a section here. Let's say that means you're allowed to use this part. Well, that still doesn't help you because this just ultimately makes the turn wider and it's more distance you have to travel. As y'all can see there, yes, you can go entirely on the track there, on what is not naturally there, even though there are cones in the way. But the amount of distance you have to travel, even though theoretically you will be carrying momentum at about this point, will not be worth doing. The distance traveled makes your time slower overall than the amount of momentum you carry from it. So therefore, it's still overall not worth doing. So that would be my wording for how PD should do this, is ultimately make it to where 2 tires on what is not naturally there. Whether that means pavement, painted pavement, whatever color it may be painted, rumble strip, or cones. Cones is kind of a gray area, but ultimately it's already been shown PD allows cones to be hit sometimes, but then even if you get remotely close to them, others, it's still a penalty. So even though cones kind of makes a gray area, it's already a gray area as is. So at least my thing could fix some other gray areas, even though there's still sort of kind of one there. If y'all have a better idea, leave it in the comments. But ultimately, I think my idea is most fair. If you have 4 tires on the natural part, what was there before the track was, it's penalty. 2 tires or less, you're good. To me, that sounds logical. What PD has currently is not very logical. Penalizing you for getting hit by another driver that should have been ghosted in the first place, and then also penalizing you for not hitting cones, but then yet not penalizing you for hitting cones. There's no logic to that. So yeah, PD is definitely doing things that just PD makes sense. They just plain don't make sense, but hopefully with this argument I can make a bit of sense in this